welcome to today's reading, or tonight's reading. It is evening now, isn't it?
It is.
All right. So, my name is Al-Mohamed. I am an author, award-winning filmmaker. If I didn't put the award-winning in front of it, my wife, who's in the front row, would yell at me because she's done it before publicly multiple times. And disability policy executive. I've written some novels, several short stories. What you're going to hear from me today is my very first solo novella, which is The Labyrinth Archivist from Falstaff Publishing. Yay. And actually several of them are in the room, so I have to say nice things. But I will actually honestly say, I actually said some things at one of my previous readings about this, which is, one, I wanted to write a book with a character of color who happened to have a disability and was in love with a woman. And when I said I wanted to do that, they said, sure, send us a chapter, we'll see if you're any good. And I sent the chapter and they said, great, go finish it. And so this novella was actually kind of the result of that. And I'm not sure too many other publishers would be willing up front to do that when you start saying, when you want to have that many different kind of minority identities included. So for that, I am actually grateful, and hopefully it'll be an enjoyable story. So with that, I'm going to start reading. As a heads up, I don't see well, so I actually am doing the audio from here. So it reads to me, I read to you. And it will work out, maybe. The last time this happened, my mom called me in the middle of the reading, and that didn't work out so well, because she talked to me, and then I was talking to you, and it was not the same part of the book. All right, so Labyrinth's Archivist. Azulea could smell grilled meat from Tamir's stall in the souk abutting the archive. Her stomach rumbled, reminding her that she'd skipped the midday meal in her nervousness. The grand parlor was large, a loud room filled with travelers and traders, merchants, and even a few scoundrels. It was a place for them all to relax from their journeys, imbibe beverages from a multitude of worlds, and eat large quantities of wholesome, if not extravagant meals, while swapping lies about adventures and dangers they had faced while traversing the labyrinth. The hard stone floor and high ceiling let sound billow and rebound off the walls in a way that even the thick woven rugs could not prevent. The sound spilled out the retractable front wall that was wide open to encourage airflow through the building during the heavy heat of the summer afternoon. Now, the grand parlor is not a suitable location to host an informative interview about the labyrinth. It's too crowded and too public. Yet, here she was. Azulea asked Mosa to repeat what he had just said, again, for the fourth time. The guttural rumblings and high-pitched squeals of the Lacerti language, spoken through a face full of sharp teeth, weren't natural to the human larynx. After only 10 minutes of speaking it, Azulea's throat was already raw. The strange, reclusive lizard men had not visited the archive in her lifetime, and Azulea knew of only a handful of people who were fluent. She was fortunate that her gift allowed her to learn languages easily. Azulea never forgot anything. Every word, every sound, every smell. It was as if things were just burned into her brain or shelved in a library. She just had to think hard enough to retrieve the memory. Grandmother, I am so grateful you made me study so hard, even the forgotten languages, she thought with a flare of warmth before returning her focus to the room. Azulea knew better, but she gambled that the grand parlor would still meet their needs. She'd asked the Lacerti trader to meet with her, hoping she could bring information that the archive didn't have. He was scheduled to leave the following morning with a caravan, and his travels through the labyrinth had included fringe worlds, of which the archive knew little. It wasn't protocol, but it was an opportunity that was just too good to miss. This would be a coup if she could capture new information. Penny, Azulea's cousin, sat next to her, acting as scribe. Penny was terrible at languages. She could write faster than most people could speak, but when it came to speaking other languages herself, Penny rarely got past basic greetings and the dirty words. Yet together, as a team, they were able to operate as full archivists. Azulea only hoped this would finally prove their worth and wouldn't lead to yet more heartache. They needed this to be a success. Mosa's voice was a gargling rumble, Azulea translated. It was only on the second night when the flapping of leathery wings came down. Claws scraped against the hides of our tents. Hundreds of tiny bodies battered against our shelter. Outside, our mounts screamed as they were devoured. She could hear Penny. The The younger woman kept moving, fidgeting, pulling her hair, swinging feet that didn't quite reach the floor. Despite the bright daylight streaming in and Penny's nearness, Azulea's damaged eyes didn't allow her to see Penny's form clearly. She was just a shadowy splash of color with bright yellow hair. Azulea ground her teeth. Her cousin was probably ogling the crowd. She was known amongst the trainees for her roving eye and less than discriminating taste when it came to choices of bed partners. Azulea remembered too well the many nights when she had lain awake listening to Penny's noisy lovemaking. They'd been young students then, sharing a room. That was before, when Azulea still believed that she'd be allowed to become an archivist despite her blindness. Penny, focus. She couldn't see what had caught the other woman's attention, but it definitely wasn't on the conversation with Mosa. Hun exrendi barthra, Mosa. The words were a bark of sound in the Lacerti language. Azulea translated without thinking. City killer. Her head whipped toward the speaker. It came from someone standing a few feet from their table. She couldn't see him, but she recognized that voice. It belonged to Davar, a merchant from Elysia. He had a tendency towards boastfulness and was not always as detailed and accurate with his accountings. His slipshod advice had never gotten anyone harmed, yet. And now he had just publicly called Mosa a killer. Mosa stood so abruptly that his chair rocked with the violence. No, I'm sure he didn't mean that, Azulea said to the Lacerti. The syllables were rough staccato gulps of sound that clearly rang out through the parlor. Even if no one understood the language, what was happening was clear to everyone. Words filled Azulea's mind from classes and books read to her years ago. The Lacerti are a fierce and proud people. Rage smolders in their chest like a hearth of burning fire, and living flame runs through their veins. Their bodies have been known to reach temperatures high enough to ignite paper. Archivists should proceed with caution. But she had to do something. Azulea stood and took a step forward. She could feel the heat radiating from Mosa, who became noticeably warmer than her own human body. She now understood why they had referred to the Lacerti as the children of the sun. She didn't touch Mosa, but held her hands up in front of her, palms facing him in a non-threatening gesture, her movements slow and intent. When two people are getting ready to fight, they face each other, staring into each other's eyes, bodies posturing. The sentence flew through her mind. She couldn't remember where she'd learned it, but she was grateful. Put your body between them during this early stage, and you can break the tension. She could feel the Lacerti's muscles tightened through the boards of the floor as he shifted his weight. The air around him wavered as the heat from his body increased. Sweat beaded on Azulea's skin. Was he going to attack? She continued more softly. Think about what you're doing. She heard Penny behind her moving towards the Elysian, Davar. Perhaps they could stop the fight before it ever began. She was pretty sure that Davar spoke trade. Azulea continued. Please, Mosa, this is my first official interview. I really want to do well. The lie slid easily from Azulea's tongue. She shamelessly continued. My grandmother's ill. Another lie. The interview had been her grandmother's idea. Of course, the old woman would kill Azulea herself if she knew that she'd attempted an interview in a public setting like the grand parlor. The distractions, the noise, and sometimes unpleasant interruptions. Like what was happening now. It was always a staggering cacophony. Azulea tried to look vulnerable. Please, I don't need a fight. Mosa was large, even for a Lacerti. Azulea's head barely came even with his midsection. His reptilian head with its massive jaws curled high over her own, a shadow just beyond the range of her limited sight. She could smell the heavy wool of his drape as it warmed against his body. Silence spread around them like a wave, rushing towards the ends of the room as more and more travelers noticed the commotion. The clink of glasses and murmurs of conversation ceased. Where was the barman, the servers? Azulea's mouth was dry and her stomach churned. Behind her, Penny's voice was an unintelligible murmur as she attempted to talk down Davar. Azulea heard the rattle of the Elysian's gills. Whatever Penny was saying, it wasn't working. She remembered the description of those gills from her sessions with the head archivist. They were an evolution that allowed the Elysians to live in their swampy world. When threatened, they could flutter them quickly and flare them out around their neck, like a great fan to frighten away predators. It was a sign of threat. Azulea turned her head towards the Elysian, slipping much more smoothly into his musical sing-song language. Devar, this is Mosa's interview. This is not the time nor place for your opinion. Devar's gills rattle again. We all know about the Lacerti, destroyers of villages, burners of worlds. This time he repeated his words in trade. He clearly wanted everyone to understand him. Azulea swore internally. Mosa huffed, hot breath bursting out of him like one of the tiny steam machines that had been brought to the archive from one of the more technological worlds. He calls me destroyer. He insults my people. And you want me to forget? I could burn him up, like ashes on the air. The words were hissed and rumbled. Azulea winced, hoping that no one understood his words. The Lacerti were already viewed with mistrust by many who traveled the Labyrinth. She didn't need Mosa's threats making things worse. You know what? Fine. If the men wanted to bluster, then she could do the same. Kill her, not kill her, your fight has no place inside these walls, Azulea said firmly in Lacerti. She switched languages, again, this time to trade. And she raised her voice so it carried across the parlor. Whatever your problems are with each other, it does not enter the residence. This is sanctuary ground. And she repeated the words again in trade and let her hands drop. She took a step to the left, her soft sandals making little sound on the thick woven mats covering the floor. She now stood squarely between the two potential combatants, straightened her back, put her hands on her hips, and using every ounce of confidence she didn't have, "This is finished, or you can both continue outside the residence." She paused, "and outside of the archive," and she raised her hand in the direction of the doorway. It's a threat, and when making a threat, a little drama never hurt. There were travelers who walked the labyrinth who preferred to keep their secrets, but many knew and understood the value of the archive and the role of the archivist. Their maps were prized, their information and attention to detail ensured that merchants and traders were able to make cross-world travel less dangerous and more profitable. Everybody won. Now, to be threatened with losing access to the archive is serious, and fighting or threatening the safety of anyone was automatic banishment. The only way the residence worked was for all those who stayed within to feel secure. Azulea wasn't sure she had the authority to banish anybody. After all, she wasn't a real archivist. They said she could never be a full archivist because of her eyes. She quickly squelched the thought. Now was really not the time for self-pity. Azulea felt a presence slide up beside her. The scent of persimmon filled her nostrils. It was Penny. Her dainty hands plucked at Azulea's sleeve. "The market guards are on their way." Imperfect timing. The Elysian's gill fluttering was lessening. She didn't need outsiders escalating events again. Lowering her arm, Azulea pasted a smile on her face. "I've been hasty. We're friends and colleagues." She turned toward the hulking Mosa, switching back to his native tongue. "Please, allow me to provide you with a gift. And thanks for the stories you'll share. I know that Ribaligua has some plum preserve hidden in a back cupboard. She couldn't see the bartender. No doubt he was standing too far away, but he was accosted with enough charm to fill 3 caravans, and his 16 eyes saw everything that went on in the parlor. That, and he always had some sweet liquor wrapped in one of his tentacles. "Ribaligua, please, a drink for Mosa." "Of course, Azulea." Ribaligua's voice was mellifluous and friendly, perfect for his role. "He's been so generous with his time, it is the least we can do." His ability to defray tension with smooth words and even smoother drinks was the reason he had the job at the residence, especially in the grand parlor. "Mosa, you like that cerulean plum, yes?" So many travelers, so many worlds, and so many attitudes. Mosa didn't move. He wasn't quite ready to give ground. Azulea touched him gently on the arm. His skin nearly burnt her fingers. It was so hot. She could feel the indecision within him. "I'd be appreciative if we could continue our interview later." The Lacerti grunted, nodded, or at least Azulea guessed he nodded, and then turned toward Ribaligua with a bellow and a growl squeak that said the preserve had better be the good stuff. With one of them taken care of, Azulea turned to Devar. She wasn't overly fond of the Elysian, and his behavior today was unbelievably provocative. Azulea frowned. No, that wasn't an accurate statement. It was aggressive. "Don't try to work your words on me, cripple. I'm not so simple," Devar growled. She stepped right up to Devar's chest and lifted her face to his. She'd been told that her brown eyes were still lovely, even if the centers were clouded. She knew being direct with her unfocused gaze often made people uncomfortable, and she was not afraid to use that to her advantage. They didn't know how to handle her blindness. They equally didn't know how to handle her competence. "What's wrong, Devar?" Azalea asked in perfect Elysian, her pitch sliding up and down over the consonants. She kept her voice so the others couldn't hear, but she didn't mince words. "You were looking for a fight." She paused, thinking, "That's not like you." "It isn't your concern," he snapped back, biting down every word so hard she could hear his fangs click together. Scaled hands wrapped around her upper arms, not tightly. He didn't mean her harm, but he was agitated and much stronger than her. "Please, Azalea," Penny interjected. Can we just go, please? Can we go?" "You there, stop!" The words were harsh and barked out in heavily accented trade. A split second later, Azalea flew through the air. Someone had tackled both her and Devar to the floor. She landed with a heavy thump, the air whooshing from her lungs. Before she could regain her breath, another body fell on top of her. Her head slammed onto the mat on the floor, and she bit her lip. Azalea tasted blood. "Restrain him!" The room erupted in shouting. There was scuffling as people moved from nearby tables. A few feet away, she could hear Devar howling that he'd done nothing wrong. A hand grasped her wrist, slender fingers, strong and well calloused. They yanked her unceremoniously to her feet. "Are you all right?" Azalea groaned inwardly. This close, with the sunlight streaming in, she could easily make out a humanoid shape with dark skin and tall, lyre-shaped horns. It was Melody, arbiter of the souk, leader of the market guard, and Azalea's ex-lover. And there we go. I think we are pretty good on time. I don't know if anybody has any questions or thoughts.
I like it.
Awesome. Well, I am glad to hear that. I had a good time writing it.
I have a question. Are you going to write more?
I don't know. I think so. I think I've been asked to write more.
I sure hope so.
Yeah, the question's definitely been put forward.
Okay, good.
The question is, what is the answer?
I would be happy to write more. I do have some ideas about where to go. So.
What would one of those ideas be?
This is why I don't take my wife, because that's her. You hear it? That's her.
Just teasers.
So, so clearly we have Azalea and Melody, and I guess one of the things is I'd like to get them to travel to some different worlds. And one of the lovely people we will meet in this book is a dashing pirate who refers to himself as Handsome Dan, or actually more other people refer to him as Handsome Dan. He may think of himself even as Handsome Dan. And he's one of those lovable scoundrels. His men get into trouble. He always has a way out. He is our Captain Jack Sparrow. He is our he's a Han Solo, yeah. And he is also the biggest pain in the ass for Melody, who likes her law and order, and this is the way things are supposed to go. And this idiot keeps making goo-goo eyes at her girlfriend. So, yes. And so the fact of going on an adventure with him is not something she's going to absolutely allow her girlfriend to go on without her there to watch over things. So, yeah, so it'll be lovely times with pirates and charming rogues, including a charming rogue who may get punched in the face if he keeps making those goo-goo eyes. So,
excellent.
So that's kind of with that, and I'm hoping for, like, I don't know, electrified force fields on ships and like flesh-eating mermaids, and I have no idea.
Ooh, yay!
So
They do the
they're kind of scary when you start reading up some of the folklore about mermaids.
Mermaids are creepy.
Exactly.
Which I don't get because manatees are so sweet. I mean, just saying.
It's all a disguise. So, but
So what else do you have out?
that's probably the biggest thing. I have some short stories that are out in anthologies. One is from the Center of the World anthology, and it is actually near future science fiction, and it is about the rise of the oceans, and it takes place in what would be modern day Oman. And if anybody thinks about the Middle East, you think about these weird desert places. So I'll challenge you now to actually Google the word Wadi, W-A-D-I, and Oman, right? Look those up and look at the photos that you get as a part of that. And they're beautiful, just valleys with water and trees, and it's fantastic. And so what I want to talk about is what happens there. And we talk about the rise of the oceans, and with the change of the environment and the impact on change in culture. Particularly in the Middle East, and what happens with the changes in tradition. So there's that. The other is actually out of a Canadian collection to celebrate the Frankenstein anniversary in Mary Shelley. And everybody talks about the idea of Frankenstein. And so this was a little bit of a philosophical, nerdy sort of a thing, because the idea is, so what happens if you wake up in a body that's died? And you're a doctor, and the idea is, well, my heart is stopped, my breathing is stopped, and the idea is, okay, that's fascinating, until you start realizing your body is decomposing and you're still in it. Mm-hmm. And so the only thing you can think of is to start replacing parts of you as they start to rot. The problem is they're not coming back to life, so they're going to continue to rot. And the weird kind of desperation that kind of comes from that. And, as when you lose your body like that, you start losing parts of yourself.
That's cool.
So.
And you have something coming out soon.
I do. So a few years ago, I actually put out a co-written novel, Baba Ali and the Clockwork Jinn, and it's a retelling of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, only steampunk set in like the 1880s, and it was a fun opportunity to mix magic and mechanicals together, and to kind of retell the tale that I remember as a kid, which is really different. So everybody thinks about Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. I'm like, if you go back to the original stories, there's actually old versions in Iraq that are called Clever Morgiana, because it was the slave girl who saved everybody, and she never gets any credit. And so, in other ways, it was another way to bring that back, and that actually should be launching at Balticon this year. So a re-release of that. So those are probably the biggest ones.
And you have film too, right?
I do.
Award-winning films.
Yeah, so give us a little blurb for the award-winning film.
Man, you guys, I hate talking about myself.
Yeah, it's kind of a whole YouTube channel dedicated to promoting our authors.
Yeah. So I'm working on it. I need some practice.
So this is
Practice. There we go. Right now, currently on the smaller festival circuit, we're putting forward a short called Touch of Love. It's actually based on my first ever science fiction pro sale, which you can still find on Daily Science Fiction. And what we wanted to do was actually talk about women and domestic violence loosely, and the idea of what happens in society where, well, the best way we can address the needs of the abusers, notice the way this is set up, is to create robots, machines that they can then abuse. It's perfect. They can address that, then they don't take it out on the women in their lives. So already you can see what's happened in the world, that we already have a word that's geared toward them, so let's take it that next step. And then from there start looking at, all right, so if we have robots who believe in think and feel, because guess what, they're going to be only more effective if they can actually feel, right? What do we teach them about human relationships and about human love if that is their only experience with it? And so it's kind of building a world out of that and then giving us a vignette of the results of that. So that's kind of where that was. Outside of that, actually, I do documentary filmmaking, and my most recent documentary is about the Invalid Corps in the Civil War, which, if you've never heard of them, actually, that's okay, because most people haven't, right? We all think we know the story of the Civil War, right? 4 years, 500,000 men have died, 40 to 60,000 amputations and injuries and illnesses, and nobody ever asks, what happened to those guys afterwards, right? Mm-hmm. The thing is, there was such a need for manpower. There were just not enough men. So rather than sending them home, they created 24 separate regiments made up of these guys, missing limbs and with other diseases, and basically put them to work. These are the men who guarded prisons. These are the men who did the provost marshal type work, which would be kind of like military police today. They did policing in Washington, D.C. They guarded supply depots. And in one very special instance, they actually saved the Union. And so our film focuses very much on the Battle of Fort Stevens, right? And just short summary on that. It's 1864. We're nearing the end of the war, right? Grant is pushing on towards Petersburg and Richmond. So to do this, right, he pulls out every able-bodied soldier out of the north, and he is putting pressure on Lee and on the city. So, right, he's locked them in. So to get some of that pressure off, Lisa tells Jubal early, I need you to get out, I need you to head north and cause as much trouble as you can. If you can get to Washington, great. And the thing is, he did. He took about 15,000 Confederate soldiers. And the thing is, because Grant had pulled all those soldiers out, he went straight up through Virginia, up to Maryland, up and around through Monocacy, and down to Washington, D.C. from the north, right?
Wow.
And he got all the way to within 3 miles of the capital. So the only thing between him and Washington, D.C. was Fort Stevens. And remember I said all those able-bodied soldiers were sent south? So there is nobody to defend the city but clerks, government officials, and this invalid corps made up of soldiers with disabilities. And they have to hold out for like this 24 hours because, you know, Grant finds out, holy crap, we need to do something. Puts the entire 6th Corps on a bunch of boats, sends them up the Potomac, and it becomes that race. And they didn't make it in time. And so they had to hold out until those reinforcements arrive. And we don't realize how close it was to losing everything until I go, Abraham Lincoln was on the ramparts of Fort Stevens. If those disabled guys went down, we would lose the Union.
Wow.
So this is a story, not really told anywhere else just yet.
Never heard it.
See? So that's a current documentary, and it's been in festivals here in the U.S. and internationally. She will be in California in April screening it, and I actually just got news yesterday. If anybody's flying Alaskan Airlines at any point this year, you also will have the opportunity to see the film.
That's
Awesome. Good job.
Yay, Jay.
So yeah, history nerding comes in handy for writing fantasy and science fiction, also for documentaries.
Thank you.
Awesome. And with that, thank you guys for being with me and part of this reading, and hopefully it was entertaining.
Absolutely.
Yes. Okay.
Good job, Jay.